Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Heaven and earth are full of his glory. You brothers and sisters gathered to give God glory for the sake of what he has done for us in Jesus Christ. I have a couple friends who are really into fishing. They are fishermen, you might call them. And I'm always impressed by the genius of people who are really into fishing. They really are kind of geniuses. Because of all hobbies, fishing requires a lot of equipment. It requires you to have stuff on hand almost at all times if you want to go fishing at the drop of a hat. I'm always impressed by my fisherman friends at their ability to fit in a little bit of fishing no matter what's going on. They're out of town for a conference. Oh, they're going to go catch some fish, going to go cast a few lines. I'm also impressed at their near telepathic knowledge of wherever they are at any given point. They always know where a good fishing hole is. It's really impressive. Now, none of my friends that I'm thinking of, maybe you know somebody, but none of my friends that I'm thinking of studied fishing in school or in college or got a degree in fishing. They all just learned this stuff by experience. By trial and error, by 20, 30, 40 years of trying to fish and failing and succeeding, they have learned what it takes. Now, in this very room, there might be a couple fishermen or fisherwomen, but there are spouses, there are parents, there are students, there are kids, there are soldiers, there are retirees, there's all kinds of people. No matter who you are, no matter how old you are, no matter if you're 5 years old or 50 years old, you've been doing what you're doing for a while. You have learned some things by trial and error. Toddlers learn so quick how to get their parents' attention, and it often involves screaming. You have learned to ask your mom for favors after dinner when she's had a couple glasses of wine. You have learned to avoid your husband when he has that look on his face, and you know exactly what look I'm talking about. You have learned things by experience. You know how to stay out of your teacher's crosshairs during class. You know how to keep your head down and not get in trouble. Do you always use that knowledge? That's a different conversation. You know what works and what doesn't, regardless of what vocation, what calling in your life we're talking about. Now, in this lesson, we see Peter at a crossroads. And it's a very similar crossroads to the ones you and I are frequently at ourselves. Because Jesus forces Peter into a tough decision. Is he going to go with what he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt to be true about fishing, or is he going to submit his own personal experience and his knowledge and his learning to what Jesus says? You and I are in a very similar predicament. We are at a crossroads. Are we going to choose what we think, what we know, what we have concluded to be true about life in this world? Or are we going to submit what we know, no matter how certain we may be, to what Jesus says? Where we meet Peter, here called Simon a couple times, both of them were his name, he's washing his nets, he and his buddies, his fisher buddies. Now this, washing your nets, that's kind of like when you put the tools away. That's kind of like when you wash out your paintbrushes, wash the paint completely out of them. That's like when you close your book and put it back on the shelf. You are done. You are calling it quits. The time for fishing has passed, Peter and his friends are saying, by washing the gunk and the dirt and the vegetation off of their nets. Because they don't fish the way that we do. They don't fish with a single aluminum rod with an ergonomic reel at the end. They fish with nets. These big honking nets, because they're not doing it recreationally. They're not fishing to pass the time. They're doing it to make a living. And so their equipment is entirely different. Their equipment is designed to catch as many of those little money makers as possible. They don't just catch one single line into the water. They dump a whole big net and drag it along in the Lake of Gennesaret in this case, hoping to trap some fish in there. And then after a little while, they pull it up, a couple of them at a time probably, because it's so heavy, because there's hundreds of pounds of water pressure trying to keep that net in the lake. And you're resisting all of that with all of your might. And this they did time and time again, over and over and over. And we later learned that they came up completely short. They didn't catch a single fish. And so this is Peter and his friends. They are admitting defeat. They're saying it's over. Well, Peter's probably saying, I've been fishing for years, and I know when to call it quits. Kind of a bummer. They're going to have nothing to take to the market and sell and make a couple bucks, but they're tired. Peter says, because he seems to be the leader of the boat, he says, it's time for us to pack it up and go get some sleep. We've been working very hard. And it's in this moment that Jesus comes up to Peter and his fisherman friends. And he says to Peter and his friends, he gets into the boat. Why? Because Jesus is trying to teach. He's trying to share the word of God with people, but people are not respecting Jesus' personal space, and it's making teaching very difficult. So Jesus asks Simon and his friends, just put out a little bit into the water so Jesus can teach from a distance. And Peter loves Jesus. He adores Jesus. He respects Jesus. So he's going to submit his schedule to Jesus' schedule. He's going to say, okay, I was going to go home, and I was going to get something to eat and go right to bed, but because you say so, Jesus, we'll put out a little bit into the water. Maybe Peter was going to listen to what Jesus was going to say. Maybe he was going to lie down in that boat and catch a few Z's, but either way, he does it. Not that much of a problem to Peter because of how much he loves Jesus, respects his rabbi, his savior. But then when Jesus finishes up his sermon, he says, amen, that's it, you guys go home. And then he turns to Peter and he says, put out a little bit into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Peter, summon what shred of strength you still have and do something that by all metrics, by all reports, by all observation, is completely pointless. You have been fishing all night. Your shoulders are practically popping out of their sockets. You want nothing more than to just go to bed. I want you to do a little bit more fishing, Peter. I want to go fishing together. And so if you're Peter, you can imagine the bind that you're in. And the way I see it, Peter has three options. Option number one, Peter can disagree. He can say to Jesus, okay, Jesus, I love you, I respect you, you're amazing, you're a great teacher, you're a great healer, but that's kind of your lane, Jesus. You are the teacher healer. I'm the fisherman of the two of us. And trust me when I say, if I would cast my net one more time, I can guarantee nothing's coming up. Why? Because we've been casting our net all night long, and now that the sun is up and the fish can see our net, nothing's going to happen, Jesus. Leave this to me. I know what I'm talking about here. He could say that. Or, option two, is he could quietly, politely, maybe passive-aggressively ignore Jesus. He could pretend not to hear what Jesus said. He could pretend to be asleep. He could just say, yeah, while he takes the boat back into shore and then ties it up and just move on and pretend not to hear Jesus. Or he could obey. He could go against everything that he knew to be true about fishing and about the very thing that he has been making a fine living on up to this point and completely submit that to this simple command of Christ for this moment. Now, brothers and sisters, you have been doing what you're doing for a long time. Even if you've only been on this planet for a couple years, you have figured stuff out about the way the world works. You just have. But here Jesus is climbing into your boat and telling you what to do. And make no mistake, what Jesus is telling you to do contradicts what you think you know by experience. Jesus climbs into your boat and says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to wait until you're married to have sex. This is what I want you to do. I want you to forgive even when someone's not sorry. This is what I want you to do. I want you to sacrifice over and over and over and never, ever respect or expect anything in return for those sacrifices. I want you to share your faith. I want you to tell people what they should believe. I want you to talk about me, not just like I'm a sports team that you root for, not just like I'm a restaurant that you really like, but like I'm actually telling you that I'm the only way of salvation. I want you to put that message out there by the way you live and by the way that you talk. I want you to love your enemies so much that you would even do that for them, that you would even share me with them. And we say, Jesus, You don't get how this world works, do you? You don't get that if I withhold pleasure from myself, that makes life very hard, and that makes me very crabby. So I don't think I'm going to follow your will about about the types of pleasure I pursue. Jesus, you don't understand that you got to give respect to get respect. So I shouldn't have to love someone if they don't love me back. I shouldn't have to serve someone if there's nothing in it for me, Jesus. It just doesn't work that way. That's how you get walked all over. That's how you get killed sometimes. That's how you get abused, Jesus. It's not how it works. And share my faith, Jesus? Are you kidding? In this world where people are so volatile, where almost everything out of anyone's mouth is considered so controversial, where somebody just makes a simple mistake and then they wind up on social media with their name dragged through the mud. You want me to step out there and put my neck in the noose for people to make fun of me for being a Christian? You want me to tell people what to believe? People don't do that, Jesus. That's not how it works. But of course, I would never say that to Jesus. Of course, you and I would never say that out loud. We're much more likely to go with Peter's option 2, aren't we? To just kind of nod and say, yeah, okay, and then just move on with our lives. In a couple minutes, as soon as this sermon is over, we're going to pray together the prayer of the church. And in the prayer of the church, if you look ahead of it, we're going to ask for Jesus' help. We're going to ask for Jesus' motivation to get us out there, to open our lips so that we can declare his praise, so that we can share his goodness with other people. Now, and when I pray that, am I going to think, yeah, that would be nice? That would be fine if we did that. That would be cool. But it's not going to happen. But that's not the way that it works. I would even say the words of a prayer. I would even pray, your kingdom come and hallowed be thy name in the Lord's Prayer, and yet do nothing, have no interest in God's kingdom of the gospel coming through me and hallowing God's name through my words in my life. Does that happen? Of course it does. I do this all the time. Pray a prayer that I don't actually, with 100% of my heart, believe is the right thing for me. But think about that. How arrogant can you get to base what you think life should be like on just a handful of experiences? Because you've been on this planet for a while, but not that long compared to eternity. And on the basis of one conversation that went bad, you're going to decide that sharing Jesus is not for you. On the basis of one person who betrayed you, you're going to decide that loving your neighbor as yourself just ain't it. Compare that to what Jesus knows about the way the world works. Does anybody know the way the world works better than the one who created it? Better than the one through whom all things were made? Does anybody understand what's best for us better than the one after whose image we were created? Does anybody understand what this world needs, what the human race so desperately lacks, than the one who was sent into the world to give what this world lacks to it? Why should we submit our conclusions based on our experience to what Jesus tells us to do? Well, I think he knows better. He's seen generation after generation of humankind come and go. He's seen what we can do to each other. He sees what we so desperately need, and he sees who we are to our very core. So if he tells us that something is good, we're much better off just believing it, aren't we? Even if we have experienced something different. And Peter realizes this all in a second. He realizes that he's talking to the one who is always right. He realizes that he's talking to the one who knows much better than he does. When the catch of fish gets reeled in, when beyond all logic, everything Peter would ever know about fishing, all of a sudden he catches the biggest catch of fish he's ever seen in his entire life. Then he realizes who he's in the boat with. And he sits there and he says, he falls at Jesus' knees and he says, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." He's having the same reaction that we read about in our first lesson in Isaiah, right? Isaiah sitting before the glory of the Lord, seeing just a glimpse, just a snapshot of God's glory, but still it's enough to absolutely terrify Isaiah. Peter stands before the Lord, the Jesus Christ, and he sees a glimpse of his glory through this miraculous catch of fish, and it fills him with fear. Why? because of his experience. Because of the conclusions based on experience that we often try to ignore. My experience tells me that as far as holiness goes, I am far from it. My experience tells me that as far as deserving to be in God's presence goes, there ain't none of that going on. My experience tells me I'm nothing but a dirty, rotten sinner, and I don't deserve to be in God's presence. I don't deserve Jesus to be in the boat with me. I don't deserve, much less to have Jesus speak to me. And that fills us with fear. But Jesus confounds our experience. Just like with the command to catch some fish, Jesus is almost happy to upset everything we possibly knew. And this is how he did it. Virgins don't give birth, and yet one did. Gods don't care about their creation. The gods that people worship want human beings to rise to their level. Gods don't sit up in heaven, then come down to our level. And yet, the one true God did. Gods can't die. And yet, the one true God did. And people don't come back to life. Once you're dead, you are dead. And yet, one person did. God is in the habit of confounding what we think we know by experience, and thank God that he does. Does your experience tell you that you are nothing but a guilty, dirty, rotten sinner? God confounds it and declares by that very virgin birth, human life, death, and resurrection, and now glorious reign, that's not the truth. Do you feel like you are nothing but sin, that you keep failing over and over again, and that God will never love you? Well, God has declared beyond a shadow of a doubt through the ministry and work of Christ, that is not the truth. He does love you. He has declared his love for you. Confound your experience if you feel, based on what you have seen, that you don't deserve God's love. God said it, so let it be. He says, I love you. You are my child. That's it. You're forgiven. You're destined for heaven. And do you feel like you are good for nothing? Like you can't offer this world anything? God, Jesus, could not disagree more. Because why did he do this amazing miracle of allowing Peter and his buddies to catch the biggest catch of fish they had ever seen in their lives, so that they could see that for the rest of their lives, it will be God working through them? Jesus immediately calls Peter and James and John into the ministry to share the gospel. Now, why did he do that? Why didn't he just target the really important people? Why didn't he go after Caesar first and then convert the whole empire when you get their king? Why didn't he go after the Pharisees, or all of the Pharisees, the influential people? Why did he go after ground zero, a poor working class fisherman? Well, doesn't it make sense? If our relationship with God really is about grace, really is about his power, really is about his forgiveness, then this makes perfect sense to call people like Peter and James and John, to call people like you and to me, to be his conduits of grace into the world. And isn't that amazing? That God not only loves you so much that he pre-planned your salvation throughout eternity, he not only loves you so much that he has handpicked a spot in heaven just for you that is waiting for you when it's your turn to leave this earth, but until you get there, so closely does he want you to him that he is going to be in you and working through you to bring that same powerful gospel to others. And I have to think that Peter thought about this shoreline conversation when he had a different experience, a different miraculous catch, I guess you could say. I wonder if Peter thought about this moment in the boat with Jesus later on when he preached one sermon in front of thousands of people, and so many of them believed. I wonder if Peter thought about this miraculous catch of fish when he caught a different miraculous catch, when so many people now believed in the gospel due to his Pentecost sermon. And I wonder if he remembered that it was Christ who always said he would work through him on that day. Of course, the meaning is different. when Peter catches these fish, what are they for? They're for killing and taking to the market and selling. That's not what we're called to do, obviously. We're called to do the exact opposite. The way of fishing for Jesus is to give life, is to free people from the dominion of darkness by which God has freed us. And you and I will say, but doesn't that take a miracle? Isn't that amazing? Isn't the Pentecost thing a miracle? Isn't the catch of fish a miracle? We don't see miracles happen every day. Instead, we see anger when we try to share the gospel. When we try to live the gospel, we see inconvenience at best and oftentimes discomfort. When we try to share the gospel, when we try to live according to what Christ has done, it hurts. It causes suffering. Is it true that anything can comfort that? That would take a miracle. Well, why are we so sure? Why are we often so sure to conclude that our efforts are wasted? When you came to faith, what happened? Was it because the person sharing their faith with you was so important and influential? Was it because their words were so well crafted and clever and funny and an airtight argument? Was it because all the conditions were perfect? No. These things are important. But oftentimes it was when you were just a baby. It was when you were lost in your sin. We were talking about the Apostle Paul in Bible class. He was on his way to Damascus to kill Christians when Jesus showed up. Why would it be any different for anyone else? Why would we doubt God's power to change a heart, even if that heart is sinning right now, even if other stuff in that person's life is going on? But we wonder, don't we? Because if you share your faith with your friend and you express that maybe her drinking is getting to a point where she's harming herself, and you say something about that, and then she ghosts you for weeks on end, and you think that conversation was a failure, are you sure? Or there's a family that you expected to see this morning and they're not here, and let's say you talk to them later, and then they don't reply, and then weeks and weeks go by and you still don't see them in church, and you think that conversation was a waste of breath. Are you sure? You might be the only person in someone else's life who has ever mentioned Christ. You might be the only person in someone's life who has ever loved them enough to express your concern about their lifestyle or anything like that. You might be the only person in someone's life who has the ability to share Christ. And so why in the world would that ever be wasted? And you've seen what Christ can do. Christ doesn't ask you to reach into people's chests and change their hearts. That's his job. He just asks you to go fishing. Is there any other reason to do it than just because Jesus says so? What is the thing that gets Peter to subordinate all his experiences, all his knowledge, all his conclusions simply to Jesus' will? He says, because you say so, Lord. He does it simply because Jesus asked him to. Do we need any other reason? Why should we stress and fight to live God's will in our lives, despite how often it results in discomfort, maybe even persecution? Of God, am I really a king and a priest in God's kingdom? Am I really wanted? Can God actually do good through me? Well, do you need any better answer to those questions? Then yes, Jesus says so. And when we consider bringing Jesus into our conversations, into our relationships with other people, getting clever about it, thinking about how we might present the gospel to someone else, and when we start to wonder, is it even worth it? Yes, it is. Why? Because Jesus said so. And if we are even tempted to question, will God bring my friends of faith? Will God be able to work through this gospel? We can say the same thing. Of course he can. Because he says so. Amen.